Welcome to the Crossing the Line podcast. I'm your host, Joelle Castex. Today, we're joined by Dr. Glenn Lipson, a clinical and forensic psychologist with decades of experience in prevention training, supporting trauma survivors, and helping individuals build resilience after harm. Dr. Lipson brings deep insight into the psychological impact of abuse, especially educator sexual abuse, and importantly, the pathways towards healing and strength. Welcome to the show, Glenn. We're so happy you're here.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for this opportunity to share what a lot of us have been doing to make the world a better place and safer for all of our kids.
So let's start at the beginning. How did you get involved with NC Sesame and combating educator sexual assault?
So let me answer the easy part of that question first. So as an expert witness, I recognize that as a compound question, so I'll break it into two elements.
Oh.
So Sesame, I met through Troy Hutchings. We met because I was creating training to prevent sexual misconduct in schools. And part of the reason was I was called in by attorneys who began having me talk to school boards and different people about how this could be prevented. And a group of attorneys that work with schools said, you should hire Dr. Lipson to create training to prevent it. So that happened with a school district in California, Grossmont Unified School District, a high school district, who I then began to create training. And I began to do it the way I've worked. And the way I've worked is I come in as someone who learns from the expertise of the people in the community. So I began meeting with kids. I began meeting with parents. I began meeting with teachers. I began meeting with administrators. And then we began to put together the training. And through that training, I realized I had something similar to what Sesame was trying to accomplish. So I reached out to Terry, and then Terry connected me with Troy and other people in the area. And when I met Terry, I found out that we had been working with many of the same people in human trafficking and protecting kids over many of the same years, and there was an immediate connection. Because one of the things that's important is for those of us who work in this area, because when you hear these stories, it could be so heartbreaking, that we have each other to talk to and support in terms of the impact of the pain we hear from other people. So there was an immediate bonding with Terry and Sesame, and I agreed to be on the board of advisors.
Let's talk about some of the trainings you've done, and especially in helping school districts and teachers figure out boundary violations. What can you tell me about that and that kind of training?
Well, I think one of the things that we've done is, and these came out of conversations I've had with Troy, who was the subject matter expert for the Model Code of Educator Ethics. We talked about how abuse is a process, and there's a slippery slope. So what we do is we go in with the fact that most people who go into education go in with the disposition of caring. And sometimes that caring leads to someone becoming overly involved. And that over-involvement can lead to inappropriate sharing, can lead to inappropriate anger, could lead to inappropriate intimacy, and all that is damaging because that's not necessarily the role of the person who, out of caring, ends up demonstrating how the road to hell is paved initially by good intentions. So we recognized, and this is similar to Charles' work, we recognized that there are people who come in with caring, get overly involved. And then initially there were those who were predators, and similar to predators who go to watering holes where animals are going to be, they know where the herd is, they look for a while and pick out the weakest animal. There were people who chose schools because they wanted to be with children, and that's where the access was. So what I did with that is I recognized those two models are useful, but it's a little more complicated. And I came up with 4 other ways of understanding this. And all this was based on the understanding that there are different pathways. So one of the pathways is what I call the alchemical error. And the alchemical error is when someone tries to make the lead of their experience, how horrible school was, different for someone else who's like them. And that then leads to mistakes because it's more about them than it is about the student. And it's more about their history. The other way that I've dealt with, and this has been true of female teacher sex offenders, I call Back to the Past and the Future. Remember the movie Back to the Future? So Back to the Past and the Future captures how someone's attention from members of the opposite sex that never occurred while they were in school suddenly becomes like an aphrodisiac. And they get involved often with the different population of students who are more successful, that not necessarily the students who have leaden experience they're trying to perform. But this could be an athlete, this could be a good student, and they get involved inappropriately. And what they've done is they've gone back to the past. The other way that I've seen happen, I call historical blindness. And I've seen this in administrators. When we're dealing with 1 out of 4 women who've experienced some form of sexual abuse, and we're dealing with men or boys who are also sexually abused, if someone hasn't dealt with that pain and they haven't shared it with anyone, they may miss this going on in the environment when they are an administrator. So I've seen administrators who believe because they've been abused, never shared it with anyone, it can happen under my watch. And I call it historical blindness because based on their history, they're not able to see things because they haven't dealt with those issues themselves. So that's a different experience I've had. And part of it is because they don't want to believe it's going on under their watch, they overly give people the benefit of the doubt to the extent that they don't do what we say in Violence Against Women International, that you have to start by believing. There's a central mantra for End Violence Against Women International, start by believing. And I think that's very important. You don't end up investigatively or therapeutically or administratively helping someone if you immediately challenge them in a manner in which you suggest maybe they're lying or not telling the truth. It's so hard for someone to come forward. So start by believing that what they're telling you is significant to them, and you'll sort out the rest later, but start by believing. So the last pathway was rebel without a cause, referring to the Dean movie, James Dean. And here's the issue of someone who gets overly close to students, often around, they don't have the same respect for rules that are related to speeding, having a kid in the car, on your motorcycle. Often the students become sources for them of marijuana or other sorts of things. So they sort of join in this anti-hero sort of thing, but the very things they're doing lead to boundary violation and potential exploitation. So in this work, I began breaking this down into what are different ways to approach. And when you have that essence, you then could build into training a level of reflection on what are your areas of risk? What is your history? How does that influence you? What are the students you're more likely to be at risk with? And so this training is looking at a different level. Standard training will look at grooming, looking for predators. Predators are only one aspect of the whole picture. But that's the way it tended to be synthesized. And it tends to be grooming laws rather than looking at what are the pathways And the concept of grooming is really a predator based. You have someone coming in with this goal and this motion and this motive. It doesn't talk about this process or slippery slope that happens. Troy is fond of quoting the ethical ethicist and Carolyn Stone, who says boundary violations always take place in terms of a role. You end up overly involved. Let me give you an example of one with the teacher. We had a teacher who had been depressed and had been hospitalized. She had a student who just came out of hospitalization. So she took this student under the wing, and the student was calling her rather than the therapist. And of course, that could be life-threatening because she wasn't trained to handle this. It came out of a good place. But that's a way that people get into trouble. So that's that role piece. So role in time. When are you speaking to people? And part of the problem is a lot of us grew up where you didn't get calls after 9. The internet is 24 hours a day. And a lot of things are happening to the communications that happen online. So time. And then place, the third element that Dr. Stone speaks about, is when you meet someone in a place other than school, or you use the place when others are not there. And so we began to look at what is this slippery slope. And one of the things that Troy points out is it is not like this, really steep. It's really gradual. And so my background was I looked first at therapists that got inappropriately involved with people. And I benefited from something called the Sexual Exploitation Index, where familiarity created later problems with intimacy. Later, when I looked at stalking, I realized that we're in a society where the dyad is emphasized. And I've seen too many educators and other people who work at school feel they have a unique connection with a student. And this is basically a soulmate, and they connect with them in a way. And if you look at our music, our movies, everything is based on the dyad.
Tell me, can you explain the dyad really
Yeah,
quick?
the dyad are two people
okay.
that come together. So you find the connection that you want. So we have to raise our children not in the myth of someday my prince will come, or someday I'll find my princess, or prince, depending on orientation. But we have to raise our kids in a manner where we don't focus all of our energy on that one relationship, because that focusing on that one relationship then sets someone up to be manipulated, because that one relationship becomes more important. So I was looking at this issue of dyad and how it comes to play and then influence the choices that people make.
So in the Verifent webinar, which our listeners will have heard in an earlier episode of this podcast, Earl Shakeshaft talked about this slippery slope. And I find it so intriguing because I've been doing a lot of work in the space for a long time, and no one has ever expressed the issue with educator sexual misconduct like you have. So I had Matt Drange on the podcast, who exposed Rosemead High School and the dozens of predators there. I went to Mater Dei High School, a high school in Orange County, California, where we've had dozens of perpetrators. And the big question that everyone always has is, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Were they perpetrators who were attracted to this school, or was it an environment that kind of made it okay for these kind of behaviors to happen? And I'm seeing, I don't have the experience at Rosemead, but I'm seeing it at Mater Dei and with the survivors I've worked with there, that this slippery slope comes into play. Because I don't think that these educators came in there thinking, gosh, I'm really going to exploit students. I think they came in underprepared, undertrained, and overly connected to students and carrying their own, baggage with them. And then it developed into this sexual misconduct that was so profoundly damaging to the kids.
Right. So pathways gets us out of chicken and egg because we're at a point now where there's chicken and eggs. And then the questions of how many angels could dance on the head of a pin and what came first, the chicken or the egg, doesn't necessarily help us. But there is an element in the school where it is not supporting people, and teachers end up, and other educators and people who work there end up very isolated. It's this isolation that is life threatening. And here's where I bring in this concept of loneliness. And that is, we know you die 12 to 15 years earlier if you're lonely. It affects your immune system. It affects the onset and progression of Alzheimer's and other mental deteriorating conditions. People need relationships. And unless they have healthy relationships, they find others that are not healthy. So I've created micro courses that are 5 to 7 minutes to have meetings with people to just discuss these concepts of how vulnerabilities are created. And in these environments, we need people to support each other better in order to make it through. We need community. We need healthy connections, because if we don't have healthy ones, we'll have unhealthy ones. So that then creates a problem, and that is sometimes litigation drives people to be more fearful, not as genuine, and not reach out to others. So we have to handle litigation in a way where we're able to prevent the harms from happening, but not create a whole other set of harms, where we have situations where the schools aren't meeting the kids' needs or the needs of the employees in terms of having frank conversations because they're afraid to be perceived a certain way. And, that's something that's not necessarily talked.
So I don't, I'm not intending for you to give away any of your precious materials and stuff, but like for an educator, what do you see educators experiencing that they don't talk about, for example, in a colleague who may be violating boundaries? And what kind of advice do you have for those educators to step up and do something?
Well, I think one of the tools is the model code of ethics for educators, because what we're trying to do is create that as a ground for safe conversations. So when I've done training for elementary school, which is different than high school, because I've created different trainings for different populations, I focus on what are the stories that someone could be telling. So what I do is I come in from the perspective of not that you're guilty, but how could things be perceived? And the earlier we start creating healthier people, we're going to have individuals who make healthier choices. So what I've seen in trauma-informed schools are they end up being safer because people helping children and students with trauma end up dealing with their own trauma. And incidents of absenteeism go down, fighting in the school goes down, because what you're doing is creating a sense of community. One of the groups I support and work with is Community Matters, which came out of the Columbine shooting. Erica is now the president. It was founded by Rick Phillips, who wrote a good book on this. And after Columbine, is empowering students because they know what's going on, to help each other. So the earlier we could intervene, the better. And the problem is, out of fear and separation, because people are afraid of cumulative files and all this, there's not a lot of communication. And then part of this is encouraging people to have better self-awareness and self-reflection of what are the difficulties going on. So I mentioned to you with a slippery slope, or I'll mention it again since it was before we started recording this, is that part of what I try to explain is boundary violations start slowly. So I have the acronym GONE that I came up with Troy. One is gradually you get over-involved. As you get over-involved, you lose your objectivity because you're trying to save a student or you feel a unique connection with the student. You become negative to the rules because you know you're making a difference, and that enforces the erosion of boundaries, which could lead to harmful actions. So that's gone. Now, for an organization like a school board, I have slide, and that is they move away from what is ethical or what is correct because it's situational. This is limited. It's indicated by what they're concerned about. So they go from a departure of what would be normal, safe protocols, and then that leads to an erosion of boundaries in organizations. They let things slide. So you could be gone on the slippery slope, or if you're an organization, you could let things slide, which then leads to problems.
So let's talk about that institutional response, that slide, because one of the things that I'm finding is that the lack of institutional response or the poor institutional response many times causes more trauma to the survivor than the actual abuse itself. Is this what you're seeing in your research?
Yes, this is what I'm seeing in my practice and in my research. More emphasis on practice and research. So what I find is along these lines that the circling of the wagons, the wanting to make sure that something is going on is what leads often to a lot of problems. And someone who's abusing someone will often find someone who's hurting and or someone who is having problems in school, so they're less believable. And the ability to hide in plain sight means you make the student not believable while you look credible by building the support of so many family members and other faculty members. So the unwillingness to perceive this is going on makes it difficult and not wanting to see it. So that makes things hard from the institutional perspective. If we recognize that one of the inherent risks in caring is over-involvement and we need to keep each other from becoming overly involved, then we're approaching this institutionally from a different perspective. But it requires a shift because if our focus is on avoiding lawsuits, that then creates an element of fear and proof of documentation, and people believe you're only doing this to avoid lawsuits. Now, for the person who's the survivor, and I use the word survivor purposefully because I want to empower that person. I also want to empower that even though they were harmed, they did form a genuine connection, but were deceived. I don't want to make what happened have no value and reflect poorly on them by using the word exclusively victim. I could use it interchangeably, but I won't use it exclusively. For them, it could be law enforcement, the school resource officer, the people who do not believe them mirrors what they're told, that no one's going to believe you. And they've been set up not to be believed by the comments this educator may have made. This person's always making up stories. And then that creates a problem. So institutional betrayal is not responding in a manner where you help the person who's been harmed, but you're also not preventing other people from being harmed. And for that person who's experienced this to believe that there now are more people at risk is really another burden on them. And I've seen families in which a younger sibling later gets abused by the same teacher because they know what goes on in this family hasn't led to a report or a police action.
There's so much here again to unpack, and I'm very intrigued when you were talking about, the institutional response and the community response when the educator who is sexually abusing students, when the student comes forward, and it's so easy to discredit the student and so easy to stand behind the educator. And that's my long way of saying, going back to you talked about educators being over-involved. And it's those over-involved educators, well, he would never do anything like that because he came to every practice and the kids love him. She would never do that because she's the drama teacher and does all these plays outside of school.
Right.
And so you can see it's all these pieces are fitting together, and institutionally, they don't want to see it because they look at those teachers, the over-involved teachers, as their best teachers because they get the best reviews and they're teacher of the year and people like them the most. So I can see for an administrator who might have trauma of their own, might not be trained, might not want to have the difficult conversations. It's just so much easier to let this slide.
Well, and let me add to that. We tend to see people like ourselves. So because we wouldn't do it and we're in a school, we don't want to believe someone else would do it. And in addition, the majority of the people who are so over-involved, they end up not necessarily crossing boundaries. They're always there for their students. So the best teachers show a level of involvement, and in some ways you're looking for that because there's always not enough resources, enough funding, the things that you want to accomplish, and you have someone who's investing their time and their energy. So it makes it difficult to tell from the teacher of the year, from the person who appears to be the teacher of the year, but underneath it is engaged in demonic activities. And I don't mean demonic like Halloween, but they're engaged in harmful and bad activities. So it makes it very difficult to see. And what makes it really traumatizing, and I've seen this, are co-workers appearing at these people's criminal and civil trials, supporting them, where you have the actual victim going, or survivor, why doesn't anyone believe me?
So let's talk a little bit about healing. So these survivors that you've worked with in your clinical practice, and they carry grief plus anger plus betrayal. And how do you help someone honor that experience without being consumed by it?
Well, first of all, you need to hear and listen actively. That's what's important for healing and de-escalation, to be heard. Because most people who've been harmed really never felt heard or seen. That's why the average time it took, based on the Pennsylvania study, for victims to come forward from clergy abuse was in their 50s. No one appeared ready to listen. So you can't wash away the pain that has become part of them. Now, the way I talk to people is I often refer to a painter's palette. In that, now they understand how dark things could be. They have a better sense of the blacks. They have a more complete palette and understanding of the human condition. And I have seen remarkable survivors become advocates, engage in a way in which they have translated their experience to help prevent this from happening to others. Now, how does this happen? It doesn't happen because we're not acknowledging how damaging this was. It happens because we recognize that it is through the cracks, as Leonard Cohen would sing, that the light sometimes shines through. And the issue is, how can we transform something that's been broken and will never be the same into something that is resilient and beautiful? So I refer to kintsugi, which is the Japanese art of taking broken pottery and joining it together with gold, where you make something artistic. So I've encouraged parents to become victim advocates. I've encouraged people to get involved with Sesame. I've encouraged people to get involved with legislation, and we'll support them when they're going to testify in front of legislatures. That what we're looking at is, how can we make this into something that you incorporate in a manner where you're able to work through other issues. So a lot of people who are victims have had other experiences in their lives that made them more vulnerable. So it's an issue of, now they are so hurt, they have psychological, medical, community, other attention, where maybe we could also go and start repairing other things that have existed. Because everyone comes with their own baggage. That's why what's beautiful about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, is that you're not blamed by having a parent that went through divorce if you're a child. You're not to be blamed by having a parent who ended up incarcerated. These are all different ACEs, but they're all risk factors. How do we balance these risk factors? We balance it through enabling connections that are safe. Safety is so important because their life hasn't been safe for them. And through these connections, they have those strong elements that reinforce the ability to experience joy once again. So what happens is we need to narratively help that person script a life where the earlier chapters are not forgotten, but empowers what they could create now that's going to make a meaningful difference in their lives and in the lives of others. And that's what I call post-traumatic growth. It is effortful. It doesn't erase the pain. You don't get rid of the broken pieces of pottery. You find a way to join this into something together that becomes meaningful, that you could display, that you could share, and potentially enlighten other people. You become one of the cracks through which that light comes through based on your experience into the world.
Well, and the emotions that the survivor is going through are very, very complex. You have another acronym for it, GALE, I believe?
Yes, I have Gail. So I use this in a short video to teach children in terms of how they get manipulated. And just to talk about it, one is the first letter in Gale begins with the letter G. Now, the reason I use the word gale is because this is like a gale force when it comes on. It could be damaging. We see what wind gusts do in hurricanes, tornadoes, or fires. They could spread devastation. And I want that sense of you got to predict when a gale is happening and seek shelter. So let's talk about what are the letters in Gale. G is guilt. Most survivors have been made to feel that they're responsible, that they're the guilty ones. Why? Because it keeps them silent. Guilt becomes important. And we spend a lot of time in therapy explaining to someone when you're 7, 8, 10 years old, when you're 14, 15 years of age, you shouldn't be put in that position to make those choices. You were not responsible, but they're made to feel responsible. Children, we know, feel responsible when their children get divorced. Children tend to take on that responsibility. They tend to have that guilt. And someone who's manipulative, a trickster, knows how to use that guilt. Anger. We're all afraid of people being angry at us. For women in politics, they're not even allowed to show anger. Men can, because then they're seen as a bitch, or swayed by something hormonal and not being logical. So it's been one of the challenges that women politicians have had to face.
Not just in politics, by the way.
Not
Business in
just-
general, yeah.
Yeah, in business in general. So I'm giving dramatic illustrations that we see politically, but it also happens, not that they're saying something legitimate that would be upsetting. Oh, they must be having their period or something. You know how it gets. So anger is something we have problems dealing with because anger reflects dysregulation, being out of control. And what is expressed to the person being manipulated and what they feel towards themselves is anger. And anger results in silence because they don't want to be yelled at. They don't want to be blamed. They're blaming themselves. That anger gets directed back towards themselves. Anger becomes an important tool that tricksters use to keep someone frozen in a cycle of abuse. We're unable to get out of that experience by sharing it with others. The L in Gale is loneliness, and that is If you come forward, you're going to be blamed. You're going to be shunned. I had a recent case where someone who became a teacher went back to the school where she was abused and went to tell the school. What she heard from people was, what do you expect when you hold a piece of meat in front of a wolf? This sense of you're isolated. The other element in loneliness, and I see this all the time, is that you at one moment feel special because you have this special relationship. Then maybe years later, you find out this person used all the same lines, all the same manipulation, all the same food items or drug items, all the same locations to get what they wanted, which was sex with this population. But you feel alone in this, so you can't go forward and tell anyone. So this fear of loneliness means you don't share because you're afraid you're going to end up alone when you already are alone, having experienced this, because you can't share this with your peers or other people. You'll be blamed. And E is really particular, and Gale, Gale, is really particular to the internet now, which is what's happening with sextortion, where people get a picture of you and are going to show it. They basically say that this will come out and you're now going to be embarrassed forever. And these manipulations involve Gale-like forces, and individuals need to work with an individual therapy their sense of guilt, anger, which is free-floating and bounces between the poles of self and others, including parents and other school people, the person who did it, the loneliness that they're isolated, that they're the only one who experienced this, and the embarrassment that no one's going to look at them the same way, that people are only going to see them as broken.
That is really a an amazing way to encompass all the emotions involved because, guilt and shame are very, very different things. And you feel guilty that it happened, but the embarrassment brings in the shame factor.
Yeah.
And that you will bring shame not only on you, but on perhaps your family or
Your community, your religion, any number of people are connected to you.
so. What do you see as some of the major loopholes that tricksters or predators are getting through right now that someone who's a survivor and wants to become an advocate? What kind of loopholes do we need to close? What kind of gaps are there in protection that people who are listening to this can say, "Gosh, I want to do something."
Well, I think that everyone in every school should go to the National Association of State Directors of Teacher Education and Certification website and look at the Model Code of Ethics. And the reason for this is it supports teachers, it supports parents, and the issue is, I've seen this in mental health. I've seen this in other areas. There wasn't a code of ethics in teaching to 2015. There was a code of conduct, which is different. Code of conduct is stop. Ethics is, these are the signs in the road. How do we change our speed? And the issue is creating a place to have these types of conversations. And that's part of what we're trying to do with the Model Code of Ethics and spread it. We've had some states adopt it as part of what's necessary for teaching. Hawaii and Nevada are two of them. I think that in addition to the Model Code of Ethics, we have to have teaching related to boundaries. When are you at risk? Which students are you more at risk from? A more supportive community where that student can maybe end up in another class. If you feel a unique connection that may be pulling you off center. To recognize this is a gradual process. In addition, we have to have policies which make sense. For example, you'll end up with school law firms come up with policies that don't make sense. You could never see a student alone. Well, what about a nurse who's dealing with a female student who may have a problem she doesn't want to share with other people. I'll leave it up to the imagination of the listener to come up with what that problem could be. But what about a student who hears he can't get into the college that he wants to? We have to have other students in the room. You know, we have to look pragmatically at what someone does. We have to keep we have to keep the training up. So, for example, I have micro courses. One is called Pedestal Plunge, and that is, if someone puts you up on a pedestal, recognize that before long they're going to find out you have clay feet and the pedestal's going to uh, crumble. Of course, it feels good to be the only one who can make a difference, the only teacher or counselor who's really understood your child. But recognize the harm in that and bring in other people. So, for example, I teach, and this is in one of my micro courses, and I have to redo them because I lost my platform. They were all hosted. So I'm going to go do this with George Hanshaw, is the person I work with. He's a psychologist. So this is one of the micro courses. It says, don't step into rescue, be the bridge. So to give people a tool, we have a school district where this is given out to people on a card. So what's being the bridge? One, build on the person's trust. You really trusted me, and that's very hard to do, to come forward. I haven't determined what happened, but I'm going to start by believing you. Do you hear in Violence Against Women International? And I need to build on your trust a little more. Even though you told me that I couldn't tell anyone, I know the right people to tell. Then what you do is you refer. You refer to the therapist, you refer to the SRO, you refer to the person who is appropriate to address this person's needs. And you've heard me talk about this is where this comes in, indicate they're not alone, that many people have experienced this. This is something that happens. That's what was strong about the Me Too movement. D, document what went on so it's recorded and memorialized. G, guide that person so you know they connected with the referral sources. E, get together with the community where you all know each other and you know these sources, and evaluate how effective your intervention was. So rather than be the savior, the rescuer, be the bridge.
See, that's great. I mean, it's such a practical skill because so I went through all of the sexual abuse prevention trainings for the Department of Education here in Orange County because I signed up to be a substitute teacher a while back. And there were very long trainings that, of course, people are going to tune out of. And then the shorter trainings touched on things like, get your own house in order, make sure you take care of yourself, things like that. And then it ended with, and remember, if you don't report, it also can reflect badly on your career. And it didn't have, I don't mean to badmouth the Department of Education Orange County.
You're talking about impact is what you're talking about.
And so there weren't the practical skills. It's like, okay, so this happened. Now what do I do? Instead, it was very it was piecemeal, and because I don't think they had come to that understanding yet. And this is profound because I think there's so many teachers out there, educators who are good people doing the right thing, who A, feel vilified by the bad apples, and B, feel disempowered because they don't know exactly how to identify these boundary violations, whether it be in themselves or their colleague or their best friend or whoever. So these are tremendous tools, and I think getting them in the hands of as many educators and administrators as possible is really important.
Yeah, that's what I've been trying to do. I have handouts over there that I pass out that are PDFs, which have things like that. So the bridge one's a little longer. I'm not seeing the bridge one real quickly, but the suicide one is for people who are non-mental health. And it is care to prevent a fail.
Oh, okay.
And so these are the acronyms. So Fail is someone is suicidal if they're fixated on suicide, may include homicide. Persons decided to end their life or others. Statements about death, giving away possessions, online searches. Other behaviors related to saying goodbye may be reveal fixation. Fail. A is for anger. The person often is angry about how others have treated them, been bullied, rejected, hurt. Race, religion, appearance, disability may lead them to feel they're targeted and harassed. Hatred can lead to violence. Isolation. Isolation, the person feels like a burden to others. Loneliness leads to depression, homelessness, withdrawal from life, substance abuse. And then L is leap. Hopelessness, strongest predictor of suicide, can lead to a leap to lethality. So that's the L in fail. And that's then access to those things that facilitate it. And then care is the solution, which is compassion. The first C in care, this only C in care, for their struggles. View suicide as a mean of escaping intolerable pain. Connect so no one feels alone. Use active listening skills. A is accept. Acknowledge their dark place and death. Don't argue or try to convince otherwise. Recognize it's hard for them to believe things will improve. Share that others have made it through these dark times. Remember, you heard that in Bridge in terms of isolation. R is refer. Again, resources can include counselors, clergy, books, music, online tools, therapists. Empower their hope, underscore their signs of resilience, and reinforce that they have the internal resources to rebound, recover, and make a difference. So that you get a sense of some of my work.
Yeah. So, and especially since you're talking about the suicide thing, you mentioned early on a little bit about vicarious trauma. What are some recommendations that you have off the bat for people who, whether they're, therapists or law enforcement or advocates or family members who might be dealing with this vicarious trauma after hearing so many accounts of abuse?
Yeah. So another term we use for that is compassion fatigue. And there's measures for compassion fatigue. The word we used to use is burnout.
Yeah.
And we got away from that. So the best thing is do the things that build resiliency. And what build resiliency is, for example, getting out in nature, something that's much larger. I've done this with depressed patients in hospitals where we'll go for a walk. And that's something that could help, to go for a walk, get out in nature, something larger than you are. And I mentioned earlier how, like with Sesame and other groups, talking to each other helps, that you don't carry that burden by yourself. So that's something that helps in addition. Talk to someone else if you need counseling, or if you want, or you have someone you're close to who's a member of the clergy. For some people, prayer helps. Exercise. We call urns, is what we would tell people in law enforcement. Exercise, but more than exercise, aerobics. Do things that you find relaxing. Have good nutrition, and look at sleep. Why? Because what you heard could be very dysregulating. What helps you regulate and deal with the material you need to metabolize? Laughter. Norman Cousins wrote about laughter is the best medicine. Find things that you could laugh at, that you find amusing, because you have to remember that they say a simple fool is a fool, a great fool is a Buddha. Don't take yourself too seriously. Enlightenment often comes from laughter. It's that ability to step back. And that's something that potentially could help you with trauma. Art, cooking, things where you put some of that energy into something that you're able to savor, enjoy, express. All those are elements. When you look at it as something that helps you connect, that is what happens. When you find yourself in a place where you don't trust anyone, you see people as a source of pain rather than um, inspiration, connection, healing, then you have a problem. So what we try to do is we try to find ways in which we can heal, and we don't try to carry someone else's burden.
If someone wants to get in contact with you, how do they do that?
If they want to get in contact with me, they could contact me through my email, which is DR for doctor, the psychologist part of me, G for Glenn, Dr. G. Lipson at gmail.com. And they could go to, again, go to NASDAQ. You could see the courses I created there. And I'll tell you, when we have teachers or others who need to take it because they got overly involved or had disciplinary hearings, I hear again and again that they wish they had had this earlier in their career. And they are grateful because they have to write an essay after the training to see whether or not the training sunk in. So it's a lot of the things that we talked about today. Also, the online training is makingrightchoices.com. And that talks a little bit about the different training I have. Right now, I have training in Southern California for 250,000 people in schools that I had as an advisor, subject matter resource, many different experts that I pulled in together, including Presidium.
Right. Well, I'll make sure that all these links are in the show notes, and especially the Educator Code of Ethics, which I think is something that
Yeah,
everyone should look
I
at.
I think it's important because we need places where we could discuss issues rather than pointing fingers. And the task that we have is similar to mediation, where we focus on we all have the same goal. Everyone who has a child and sends them to school wants to be safe. Anyone who goes and works in a school wants to be safe. We want to create an environment where we don't have these issues not discussed or siloed, because there's a relationship between sexual abuse, suicide, and school shootings. We have to look at all the ways in which there are disconnections, anger, and hurt that lead to harm if we're going to create safer schools that attract the right people.
Thank you so much, Glenn. And thank you for joining us for this conversation with Dr. Glenn Lipson. To learn more about the work of NC Sesame, visit us at ncsesame.org. You can also follow Crossing the Line on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. If this conversation resonated with you, please share it. Awareness is one of the strongest tools for prevention. And a 5-star review on Apple helps us reach more survivors, students, parents, and educators. I'm your host, Joelle Castex. Thank you for listening. And remember, truth protects, action heals.